David Allan Coe spent almost 2 decades behind bars before he even reached the age of 30. But prison was only the start of his story. In the 1980s, he would go on to release albums so controversial that record stores flat out refused to stock them, radio stations banned them from the airwaves, and even the FBI got involved. He received death threats for the things he sang, and his reputation became one of the most divisive in music. Yet, incredibly, the same man also wrote some of the most successful and enduring songs in country music history. It raises the question, what truly happened during those lost years behind bars? And what's the real story behind the underground recordings that remain shrouded in infamy? The truth, many say, might be darker than anyone ever imagined. David Allan Coe was born on September 6, 1939, in Akron, Ohio, and from the very beginning, life was a brutal test of survival. His father was an alcoholic who disappeared for long stretches of time, leaving his mother to pick up the pieces in a city still reeling from the devastation of the Great Depression. They lived in filthy, cramped apartments and were constantly moving, never settling long enough to find stability. By the time David was only 6 years old, he had already witnessed violent fights at home, a childhood steeped in turmoil. In the midst of all that chaos, the one escape he found was music, listening to Johnny Ace records that seemed to drown out the shouting and violence around him. Those early moments of pain and escape never left him, they would become the foundation of everything he later wrote and sang. By 1948, at the tender age of 9, David's troubles had already spiraled out of control. He stole a bike, got into fights, and was sent away to the Star Commonwealth Reform School in Michigan. While most children his age were still memorizing multiplication tables, David was locked up and forced to learn how to survive from older boys who taught him to fight, steal, and harden himself. It was in that institution, surrounded by other lost kids, that he first picked up a guitar. His earliest songs were raw sketches, drawn from the rough world he saw every day. What should have been normal school years instead became cycles of incarceration, each one shaping him into someone tougher and more disconnected. This cycle of crime and punishment would keep him in and out of institutions for nearly 20 years, all the way up until 1967. During those years, his home life fell further apart. His mother remarried multiple times, and with no real safety net, David often ran away. In an era when child protection services barely existed, he endured abuse that left physical scars across his back and arms. He would vanish for weeks, sleeping in abandoned buildings, stealing scraps of food to survive, and begging for spare change near the city's factories. One winter, he came close to freezing to death alone in a deserted warehouse. These were not just exaggerations or stories for dramatic effect, this was the reality of his early life. From a young age, he learned a brutal lesson: no one was coming to save him, and survival depended on himself alone. By the early 1950s, when David was only in his early teens, he had dropped out of school and slipped deeper into crime. He began stealing cars and was eventually caught with burglary tools. Even something as simple as a screwdriver became evidence against him, used to justify serious felony charges. Inside Ohio's juvenile system, he found no rehabilitation, only brutality. Guards didn't try to help troubled kids like him. Instead, they beat them, extended their sentences, and often allowed the strongest inmates to prey on the weakest. David grew to believe the system itself was designed to break boys like him, and that belief hardened into a defiant worldview. He made a promise to himself that he would never play by society's rules, building his entire identity around resistance and rebellion. Some of the darkest wounds of David's youth weren't just physical. He later claimed that while in reform schools during the 1950s, he was sexually abused. Those experiences would later show up in his songs, often expressed with raw rage and confusion. But as he grew older, the line between truth and fabrication in his stories began to blur. He said he had killed someone at just 9 years old. He claimed he had been sentenced to death row as a minor. None of these claims were ever backed up by records. No murder charges were filed against him. Yet what made the situation complicated was the fact that behind his falsehoods, there was genuine trauma. Some experts suggested that he exaggerated or invented stories as a way of coping with pain that was too overwhelming to face directly. But because of those fabrications, many people dismissed his entire life story, which in turn made it harder for others with real experiences of abuse to be taken seriously. By the mid-1950s, Coe was sent to the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, a place infamous for its gothic, cold walls, and harsh punishments. It was a miserable environment, but it was also where his music began to take form. Guards gave him Hank Williams records to pass the time, and on a smuggled record player in his cell, he listened obsessively. He memorized every note and lyric, and in the solitude of those prison walls, he began writing songs of his own. Those early compositions, echoing off concrete and steel, were the seeds of what would eventually become his unique sound. Between 1954 and 1957, those years shaped the voice that would one day sing penitentiary blues. By the early 1960s, David was already spinning more myths about his past. He told people he had killed an inmate who tried to attack him. He claimed he'd been placed on death row and had even met his biological father there. Years later, journalists uncovered that none of it was true. In reality, between 1959 and 1967, his convictions were for theft, possession of burglary tools, and obscene materials, not murder. When Rolling Stone reporter Jeffrey Himes confronted him about this in 2000, Coe refused to admit the lies. Instead, he retaliated by writing a song threatening the journalist. To him, the legend was always more valuable than the facts. But behind the exaggerations, something very real was happening in prison. Black inmates taught him how to play blues guitar in a way that went beyond technical skill. They showed him how to put pain and emotion into every single note. One of his major influences, Screamin' Jay Hawkins, was someone he actually met inside. In a prison system dominated by black inmates, Coe absorbed the music that grew out of shared suffering. He learned slide guitar, he learned phrasing, and he learned how to make music bleed. That influence would later make him stand out in Nashville. But the story was complicated. Decades later, in the 1980s, he would release albums laced with racist lyrics. When confronted, he claimed it was satire, saying it was ironic because in prison he had been called an ****** lover, and now people were calling him a racist. He never fully explained himself, and the contradiction would follow him for life. In 1961, while still incarcerated, he got a massive Confederate flag tattoo etched across his back. The tattoo was done by another inmate using crude, makeshift tools. That image would follow him into the spotlight and haunt his career. Around the same time, he was involved in underground prison fights, organized, bare-knuckle brawls where inmates gambled with cigarettes or even protection. Coe fought in these matches, once breaking his hand so badly it nearly ended his ability to play guitar for months. These fights became part of the outlaw mythology he later wove into his music. When he was finally released in 1967, Coe attempted to live a more conventional life, taking trucking jobs and working in rough, blue-collar environments. But the road, the outlaw lifestyle, and the biker brotherhood kept calling him back. During his stints out of prison in the late 1950s, he had already become involved with biker gangs. He rode with groups like the Outlaws in Louisville and other clubs in Florida. That lifestyle, the Harleys, the leather, the danger, gave him an identity beyond prison. By the late 1960s, he was living out of a hearse parked outside the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, busking on the streets and trying to break into the music industry. Against all odds, it worked. Shelby Singleton, a producer known for spotting unconventional talent, discovered him, and in 1969, Coe released Penitentiary Blues. The album was raw, unpolished, and drenched in the grit of prison life. It didn't sell well commercially, but critics praised it. People in the industry started whispering about this strange new artist who had actually lived every word he sang. By 1970, producer Billy Sherrill gave him his first shot at mainstream recognition. The song Two Lonely People brought him his first taste of the charts. But even in success, conflict followed. Columbia Records executives hated his constant references to drugs, sex, and prison. Studio sessions often erupted into arguments, sometimes even physical fights. Coe refused to compromise. That year, he released Requiem for a Harlequin, an album so bizarre and dark that nobody knew how to market it. Written during LSD binges and after the devastating loss of his infant child, it featured songs that sounded more like suicide notes than country music. It only sold a few thousand copies at the time, but today collectors pay hundreds to own it. By 1971, Coe began crafting a visual persona as outrageous as his music. Country legend Mel Tillis gifted him a set of rhinestone suits, which Coe paired with biker leathers, a Lone Ranger mask, and sometimes even a mohawk. He made his entrances on a Harley, sometimes driving it straight into clubs. While audiences booked him for the shock value, fights often broke out, and some venues banned him altogether. Even so, he was writing for other artists. George Jones recorded his songs during his darkest drinking years, while Coe himself drank excessively, once reportedly consuming 47 beers in 8 hours at Tootsie's Bar. By 1973, Columbia Records shocked the industry by giving Coe unprecedented creative control. He could use his own band and write what he wanted. After Tanya Tucker turned his song Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone into a #1 hit, Coe's leverage skyrocketed. He recorded The Mysterious Rhinestone Cowboy, an album unlike anything Nashville had ever seen. The songs flowed into each other with no breaks, creating a haunting, continuous piece of music. It sold over 100,000 copies, firmly establishing him as the outlaw Nashville couldn't control. Famously, he recorded it while wearing his Lone Ranger mask in the studio, later saying his father told him to hide his face because of warrants. Whether true or not, the mask became part of his identity. By the mid-1970s, Coe was no longer just a musician, he was becoming a legend. In 1975, he released Once Upon a Rhyme, which featured You Never Even Called Me By My Name. The song climbed to #8 on the Billboard country charts, but what made it unforgettable was the comedic spoken section in the middle. Coe joked that every real country song needed to mention mama, trains, trucks, prison, and getting drunk. His friend Steve Goodman added an extra verse with all those cliches, and fans loved it. The song became both a parody and an anthem, cementing Coe as a major voice in country. By 1976, Coe stood at the center of the outlaw movement. Alongside Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glazer, he appeared on the album Wanted. The Outlaws. It became the first country record in history to sell over 1 million copies. Most country albums at the time struggled to sell a third of that. Coe's presence was crucial. Not only did he sing the part, he looked it. Covered in tattoos, hardened by real prison time, he embodied the outlaw persona. Critics like Ray Waddell even wrote that no one in country looked or lived more like an outlaw than Coe. At one festival in Oklahoma, he even drove his motorcycle onto the stage wearing his Outlaws MC jacket. The local newspaper ran a headline declaring, "The Outlaws came to town," and the moment became iconic. Coe himself later claimed that incident helped inspire the very name of the outlaw country movement. Yet, as his legend grew, his life became even stranger. The IRS seized his Key West home over unpaid taxes, leaving him homeless. Instead of moving into a cheap motel, he relocated to an actual cave in Dixon, Tennessee. He later claimed he lived off wild animals, wrote songs in the dark, and tried to rebuild from scratch. Whether every detail was true or not didn't matter, the story stuck, adding yet another layer to his myth. By 1977, financial troubles and divorce battered him, but he poured that pain into his music. That year, he released Tattoo, an album many fans and critics consider his most personal. Songs like Just to Prove My Love for You revealed a man desperately clinging to a failing marriage, while tracks like Face to Face and Just in Time to Watch Love Die exposed the raw agony of loss. The closing track, Hey Gypsy, sounded like Coe searching his own soul for peace he would never find. The album reached #38 on the charts and marked his third release that year. He wasn't just writing songs, he was bleeding them. But in 1978, a blow came that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wrote Take This Job and Shove It, an anthem for working-class frustration. But when Johnny Paycheck recorded it first, the song shot to #1 and stayed on the charts for 18 weeks. It even inspired a Hollywood movie in 1981. To make matters worse, most people assumed Paycheck wrote it. Though Coe received credit, he didn't get the fame or the fortune. He later admitted that losing that song was like losing a fortune. He recorded his own version and even released a bitter sequel in 1980 called Take This Job and Shove It Too, dismissing Paycheck as irrelevant. But by then, bankruptcy had stripped him of the publishing rights. The song that could have changed his life slipped through his fingers. That same year, he released something utterly unlike anything else in country music.